Well, recording is in progress, and this is Andrew Williams Jr. with another Conversations with Andrew Williams Jr. And today we're in Concord, Massachusetts, and we're having Concordian conversations. I'm here at a place that's very famous. We're at the spot location here in Concord. That was actually the place where the Native Americans and the incoming colonialists reached an agreement that founded this city where we are now, Concord, Massachusetts. But it's also known as a place where the shot was heard, fire that was heard around the world. And I've today visited that location, not too far away from here. It's also known, however, as a place where transcendentalism got its start. It's the home of many, many, many literary heroes and people whose words have influenced the entire world. I'm happy to be here with Stuart Sinclair Weeks, who is, in fact, a native of Concord and also our host for this evening.
Thank you. And perhaps a little more to where we are. So this is Monument Square. And I speak of it as the center of the center of the center of the center. Monument Square, which you can see off not for all, but many, is the center of Massachusetts, the center of our nation, and our nation, for better and for worse, it being a slippery slope, is the center of the world. So here in Concord, we are at the center of the center of the center of the center. And what's distinctive about Monument Square, this center, is that behind me, you can see an obelisk as well, large prominent monuments devoted to men and to war. The one right here is to the First World War. The one in the middle is the Civil War, and to the left is the Spanish-American War. Often the delicate shadows of Monument Square are three other monuments, which are nearly invisible, devoted to the woman, to a matriarchal people, and to peace. So the one to the matriarchal people is that sign out there, which notes the treaty that established Concord. Not a Greenland or a Watertown, not named after nature, not a New Ipswich or a New Bedford or New Hartford, a variation on the old, but Concord means peace with an E. Concord means covenant. Concord means with the heart. And a native daughter of Concord told me that Concord also means follow nature. So these four terms are cornerstones for the work of the Center for American Studies: covenant, peace, or to follow nature. So that's the first of the invisible, nearly invisible monuments, the sign that notes Jethro's tree. Many people walk by it, don't even see it. The second is over here. You can best barely see it. It's a little small monument, knee-high to a grasshopper that anybody could trip over, that marks the jail that Thoreau went to for refusing to pay taxes in the war against Mexico. So that's a monument devoted to peace. And then here was the Pieta statue, where it's been moved to the other side of the rectory, but that statue is the statue to the mother. And the interesting thing about it is it's the only replica of the Pieta, I've been told, that is of the same marble of the original Pieta, and nobody knows how it came to Concord. There's no records about it. It just, well, I'm sure it didn't simply disappear, but nobody knows. Simply appear, but nobody knows how it got here. So the point is, and this leads in the first part of our offering, is here in the center of the center of the center of the center are these three monuments prominent, devoted to men and to war, and three other nearly invisible monuments devoted to the woman, to a matriarchal people, and to peace. I think of that as a native son of Concord as a kind of a heart to heart. In German was says Zwiegespräch, which means two speaking together. So there's a kind of speaking together here, or trying to speak together here, between the masculine and the feminine, between the male and the female. these complementarities are pretty vital, because you can't have a family without both. And if we don't know how to get along with one another, it doesn't bode well for the children. So that's what takes us into the beginning, this offering tonight. And I'm going to talk briefly about George Washington and his spiritual consort, Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley had been a young Negro slave poetess. And George Washington, who she referred to as a generalissimo, was this great white Anglo-Saxon Herculean figure. Phyllis Wheatley knocked on George Washington's door when he came north to head up the Continental troops. She was allowed to knock on the door because she had a letter from George Washington. And I'm sure the guards were surprised to see this young former slave Negro poetess daring to step up to meet George Washington, but she had a letter from him. And so the guards let her in. I'm sure Washington's secretary was surprised to see her standing in front of her. She let him in. And in my mind's eye, I see her stepping into the room where George Washington was. And she ordains him as generalissimo for the American Revolution through a poem that she had written that Tom Paine published, that got to Washington's attention and moved him so deeply that he wrote her a letter and he said, if you ever are in the area, come and see me. So we have something of a riddle here. How could it be that this young former slave Negro poetess writes a poem, and I'm going to read the poem, that touches Washington's heart in such a way in which she ordains him as generalissimo of the Continental troops, and she instructs him. She actually instructs him how to behave if he is to be victorious. How can that be? That's the riddle. So I'm going to read to you from this poem. It's much more than a poem. The term is panegyric. And she writes, this is what she originally wrote. Sir, I have taken the freedom to address your excellency in the enclosed poem and entreat your acceptance, though I am not insensible of its inaccuracies. You're being appointed by the Grand Continental Congress to be generalissimo of the armies of North America, together with the fame of your virtues, excite sensations not easy to suppress. Your generosity, therefore, I presume, will pardon this attempt. This is someone who a year before couldn't even speak English. She's a rather remarkable individuality. Wishing your excellency all possible success in the great cause you are so generously engaged in, I am your excellency's most obedient, humble servant, Phyllis Wheatley. This was Washington's response before I read to you the actual poem. Mrs. Phyllis, your favor of the 26th of October did not reach my hands till the middle of December. Time enough, you will say, to have given an answer ere this. Granted, but a variety of important occurrences continually interposing to distract the mind and withdraw the attention. I hope will apologize for the delay and plead my excuse for the seeming but not real neglect. I thank you most sincerely for your polite notice of me in the elegant lines you enclose, and I will read them in a moment. And however undeserving I may be of such encomium and panegyric, the style and manner exhibit a striking proof of your great poetical talents, in honor of which, and as a tribute justly due to you, I would have published the poem had I not been apprehensive that while I only meant to give the world, this new instance of your genius. How did he know that this was a new instance of her genius? I might have incurred the imputation of vanity had he allowed it to be published, such a poem. This and nothing else determined me not to give it place in the public forum. And now he writes, if you should ever come to Cambridge or near headquarters, I should be happy to see you, a person so favored by the muses and whom nature has been so liberal and beneficent in her dispensation. I am with great respect, etc. So this is a poem. So imagine, friends, if you will, in your mind's eye, this Negro slave poetess, she steps into the room, former slave, and she ordains him with this poem. I see Washington rising behind his desk, and she's speaking to him in this way. And this is what she writes. It's a bit of a fancy language, but I trust you'll follow the main thrust. She's writing on behalf of Columbia, as in the District of Columbia, as in Hail Columbia, our first national anthem, as in the Columbia Tammany Society, of which Ben Franklin was a member, as in the Columbia Space Shuttle that just happened to go down over the home state of President Bush as he was leading us into war in the Great Gulf. She's writing on behalf of Columbia, which I would say is the Anglo-American aspect of the genius of our land. There's a Native American aspect of the genius of our land. There's an African American aspect. There's a Latin American aspect. And there's an Anglo-American aspect.
Indigenous too.
So this is what she writes. On behalf of Columbia, celestial choir enthroned in realms of light, Columbia's scenes of glorious toils I write. While freedom calls her anxious breast alarms, she flashes dreadful in refulgent arms. See Mother Earth her offspring's fate bemoan, and nations gaze at scenes before unknown. See the bright beams of heaven's revolving light, involved in sorrows and the veil of night. The goddess comes, she moves divinely fair, olive and laurel binds her golden hair. Wherever shines this native of the skies, unnumbered charms and recent graces rise. Muse, bow propitious while my pen relates how pours her armies through 1,000 gates, as when Elois heaven's fair face deforms, enwrapped in tempest and a night of storms. Astonished ocean feels a wild uproar, the refulgent surges beat the sounding shore. Or thick as leaves in autumn's golden rain, such and so many moves the warrior's train. In bright array they seek the work of war, where high unfurled the ensign waves in air. Shall I to Washington their praise recite? Enough thou knowest them in the fields of fight. Thee first in place and honors we demand, the grace and glory of thy martial band. Famed for thy valor, for thy virtues more. Hear every tongue thy guardian aid implore. 1 century scarce performed its destined round. when Gaelic powers Columbia's fury found. And so may you, who dares disgrace the land of freedom's heaven-defended race. Fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails. Anon Britannia droops the pensive head, while round increase the rising hills of dead. Ah, cruel blindness to Columbia's state, lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. And now the last 4 lines, she instructs Washington, this former slave, Negro poetess, young girl, she instructs Washington on how he is to behave, which focuses a question. Who is she? Who are they? How are they related? She ends, proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action, let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine, with gold unfading, Washington, be thine. So I'm going to draw my remarks to an end with just a quote by Emerson that begins to speak to this mystery. How can it be that this young former slave Negro poetess addresses Washington in such a way? Emerson writes, "It is a secret of the world that all things subsist and do not die, but only retire a little from sight and afterwards return again. Nothing is dead. Men feign themselves dead, pretend that they're dead, and endure mock funerals and mournful obituaries. And there they stand, looking out the window, sound and well, in some strange and new disguise." I would suggest that Phyllis Wheatley really was Washington's spiritual consort, that they were deeply connected in earlier lifetimes, in ancient Rome and in ancient Greece, and that they were picking up the thread. And in fact, Shakespeare in his play Antony and Cleopatra, or maybe Washington and Phyllis Wheatley, speaks to this mystery. And not only speaks to this mystery, but takes them back even earlier in Greek history to Hercules and Medea, and many, many depictions of Washington. Many of them, paintings and sculptors, spoke of him as a Hercules. But who was Phyllis Wheatley? So I'm going to end by saying that if we recognize that we don't just have a physical body that dust to dust when we die, but we have a soul and spirit, and the soul and spirit lives on, then in the ancient days, they spoke of sleep as the little sister of death. Every night we pass away, every morning we awaken to the new day. And pretty much every great figure of the ages I've come upon has spoken to the truth of reincarnation, repeated earth lives. Matter of fact, Tacitus said, there isn't a great historian of the ages. There is in the minds of men, I know not from whence it comes, a certain presage of future existences, and it reveals itself in the greatest, most exalted minds and souls. This is a point on this Juneteenth Eve, with this depiction about how the woman and the man, Washington and Phyllis Wheatley, how they interacted, how they paid each other respect, that once we grasp nation will no longer be basis for racism, for sexism, for anything that divides us. One lifetime male, the next female. One lifetime Black, the next white. One lifetime Jewish, the next Christian. As we strive to become whole and full, that when we grasp this thought, then we'll have a basis for rising above all that divides us. John Adams said the American Revolution began in the hearts and minds of the people. And if we can grasp such a thought and make it real, I think we can create together a future worth envisioning. So I'm going to pass this back to Andrew Williams Jr., but invite any comments first from anybody who may have anything they wish to offer.
Did you hear today in that meeting that what I said about the ancient India?
Yes.
That we go through 8,400,000 life forms, and those 400,000 are human species. So all these divisions on any base, like when they asked Buddha, why should we be good with every being? He said, because with every being, we have been at some birth in close family relations. So we are all, like the native people also say, all my relations.
Right.
And the other thing I wanted to mention, I often say it in the Concord Peace video, the Civil War monument on this side, right there, say faithful unto death. I say when the consciousness of all of us come, faithful unto life, war will be impossible.
Beautiful, beautiful. Any other comments, friends? Then let's move with this beginning to this remarkable young Concordian, another young woman, Negro, former from a slave family, Ellen Garrison, who preceded Rosa Parks by nearly a century. Andrew.
Well, thank you so much. Again, Andrew Williams Jr. And guys, I'm going to turn this way so I can include you in my background. So I'll talk loud enough so you can hear me. This is how we do it in Hollywood. So I'm here. And as you see, we do have an audience behind us. And I'm here sharing information about another young Concordian named Ellen Garrison. As a matter of fact, I'm wearing her badge right now. It says Stand Up for Ellen. And that's because Ellen Garrison is one of the many family members that's honored here at a place called Robin's House. So I urge you to go to robinshouse.org and you can find out more information. ROBBINSHOUSE.org. There you'll find out much about Ellen Garrison. And this is, in fact, live in living color, so technology is only great when it works. But now I'm going to introduce you to Ellen Garrison from the information you can find on the website. Ellen Garrison was Caesar Robin's granddaughter. She lived from 1823 to 1892, 69 years. She is known as an anti-slavery activist. And of course, if I turn this down, then you won't hear it, but it looks like I'll have to start over again. Ellen Garrison is an anti-slavery activist, the daughter and granddaughter of men who had been enslaved, spent her life educating newly freed people and fighting for their civil rights. Born and raised in this house, which is Robin's house, Ellen's activism began in Concord. Early on, she learned about racial discrimination and followed in her mother's footsteps as an anti-slavery activist. At 12, she marched in a Concord parade, hand in hand with her white schoolmate. Beneath the gaze of curiosity, surprise, ridicule, and admiration, Ellen signed many petitions, a way to make her voice heard. After the Civil War, Ellen taught newly freed people during Reconstruction. Her application explained, "I have a great desire to go and labor among the freedmen of the South. I think it is our duty as a people to spend our lives in trying to elevate our own race. Who can feel for us if we do not feel for ourselves?" Concord's Rosa Parks. In 1866, Ellen tested the nation's first Civil Rights Act in court. Almost a century before Rosa Parks took her seat on an Alabama bus, Ellen sat in a segregated train station waiting room, in a Baltimore train station, and was forcibly ejected. Ellen felt it was her duty to test the new law. "I feel as though I ought to strive to maintain my rights. It will be a stand for others." So true to her calling, in the hostility of the post-Reconstruction South, Ellen's teaching post was defunded. She followed Kansas exodusters in 1879 to again teach newly freed people. After a decade in Kansas as a teacher, prairie farmer's wife, and stepmother, Ellen moved with her family to an egalitarian anti-slavery community in Pasadena, California, where she is buried with anti-slave activists. So I bring this to you to uplift the legacy of Ellen Garrison, but also I'm from California. So I'm here connecting the dots in this weekend where we're celebrating what's called Juneteenth. For those of you who don't know it, it's referred to as Freedom Day for slaves. In 1865, it was on this day, or on tomorrow, June 19th, that the slaves in Texas were finally notified that they were free. This is 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was put into law, was actually signed into law, but there were still 200,000 slaves that were not free. They were only freed later in that year, 1866. December 6th of 1865. But my friend and associate next to me, whose name is Calvin Pearson, will tell you that Juneteenth has been celebrated throughout the African-American community from that very day, because it was a day of celebration. So Calvin Pearson, who's visiting here from Hampton, Virginia, also is a representative of how we're all connected together, because it's in his town, where he's a native son, Hampton, Virginia, that another female known as Harriet Tubman spent a lot of time and connected together what we now recognize as what's called the Underground Railroad, which, in fact, although beginning in the South, did in fact have a direct route on the sea to Boston, and through Boston, throughout Massachusetts, and in New England into Canada. But it's so important that we take this day, Juneteenth, to celebrate more about African-American history and American history. That's where August 25th, 1619 comes into play. But I'll let Calvin Pearson, founder of project1619.org, where you can find more information. I'll let Calvin tell you about that himself. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. I am Calvin Pearson, and I am from Hampton, Virginia. As he said, I am the founder of Project 1619 Incorporated. Since 1994, we've been telling the true history of those first enslaved Africans who were brought to Virginia on August 25th, 1619. I'm also chairperson on the Commission on the Legacy of Enslavement by the National Juneteenth Observance Foundation. So I travel around the country talking about enslavement, history of enslavement. But tonight, I've been asked to talk about the importance of Juneteenth. But before I do that, I've got some observations and some comments I want to do before I get to Juneteenth. As I said, I live in Hampton, Virginia. For many years, Hampton, Virginia was one of the most unrecognized historic African-American cities in America, because we were not a Selma, we were not a Montgomery, we were not a Birmingham. That's not true anymore, because Hampton today is known as the birthplace of African-American history in America. It's the landing site of the first ship that brought enslaved Africans to America on August 25th, 1619. We are the birthplace of the first African child born and baptized in English North America. So we have a lot of history that people are not aware of. As I walked the streets of Concord over the past few days, I started to realize that Concord is also a hidden jewel of history. From its famous Revolutionary War battle at Old North Ridge, the ride of Paul Revere, the shot heard around the world, its famous authors like Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Louisa May Alcott, to the Concord Museum. I encourage people to come to Hampton and also come here and visit Concord. I see Fort Monroe where the first enslaved Africans arrived. A lot of people thought they arrived at Jamestown, Virginia, but now we've proven that they arrived at a place called Point Comfort. Currently, today is Fort Monroe. So I see a lot of similarities between Fort Monroe and Concord on a parallel course, since both of us are some of America's oldest colonies. When the English settlers landed along the Virginia coastline in 1607, the land was occupied by Algonquin indigenous people. When the English settlers landed in Plymouth in 1620, the land was also occupied by Algonquin indigenous people. Present-day Hampton was established by seizing the land of the indigenous people and running them off their land. And wars between the English settlers and the Algonquins and the Powhatans lasted until 1644. When I look at present-day Concord, they peacefully coexisted with the Algonquins and acquired land formerly known as Musquitaquid and established the colony of Concord in 1635. But what is so amazing to me is a colony that was established in 1635, 6 years later in 1641, they institutionalized the institution of slavery. How could that have happened? Whereas Virginia only institutionalized slavery in 1661, although the first Africans arrived there in 1619. In 1661, the General Assembly of Virginia passed legislation legalizing slavery for all Africans being held in bondage and for all Africans to be born in this country or brought to this country going forward. If you study history, you know that in 1808, the United States abolished the importation of Africans to the USA by waterways, ending 188 years of forced human bondage. But slavery still existed on plantations where birthing new slaves at an alarming rate. Before the Underground Railroad was developed in the South, Concord had the Wayside House, run by Louisa May Alcott and others. It was a safe haven for slaves seeking freedom through Concord. Hampton also had Underground Railroads. We had Harriet Tubman, who was also a Union spy. She later worked at the hospital at Fort Monroe for colored Union troops. We had Mary Peach, who in the late 1850s was teaching free Black children to read and write when we know that that was against the law. You had Ellen Garrison, who taught the freed Black people to read and write after the Emancipation Proclamation. So let me talk about Juneteenth, is the reason why I'm here. By 1860, there were approximately 500,000 free people of color and 3.5 million people still held in bondage. Slavery in the US was finally abolished in 1865 on January 1st, ending 246 years of human bondage on paper. What began as slavery ended in the triumph jubilation of Juneteenth. The people of color finally got freedom I call it quasi-freedom because freedom was not freedom. But the true story of Juneteenth, as we know it, is not true. Juneteenth meant more to me when I found out the true story of Juneteenth. Like you, I was led to believe that Major General Gordon Granger and the white Union soldiers sailed into Galveston, Texas. And General Granger read the General Quarters, number 3, freeing those still held in bondage. The people, and to read the General Quarter, it says, the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves the absolute equality of personal rights, the rights and property between former master and slaves, and the connection hereto existing between them becomes the employer and hired labor. Those who are free were asked to stay on the plantation and work for your former master for wages. But that's not the true story. The true story is that on May 25th, 1865, 2,000 United States colored troops left present-day Petersburg, Virginia, on ships headed to Texas. Their mission was to free over 250,000 known people held in bondage in Texas. They arrived in the harbor of Galveston, Texas on June 18, 1865. They saw what was going on in the harbor and on the docks, and they sent word to Granger that you need to come to Galveston. The U.S. colored troops started parading off the ships, walking up the docks. Those still held in bondage dropped everything in amazement because they thought they would never see a colored man in an army uniform. Can you think of the amazement and bewilderment that these people who had been slaves or in bondage all their life finally saw a colored man in a Union uniform carrying a gun? The plantation owners were surprised too, but they knew slavery had ended. Many of them had moved their Black servants to Texas from other states so they could keep the servants held in bondage. Some historians say that General Orders Number 3 was written by one of Granger's subordinates. It was not written by Granger. Granger did not read General Orders Number 3. Historians say that they printed the General Order Number 3 and instructed his soldiers to post them on all of the Black churches and all of the public squares so people could read it for themselves and understand that they were now free. So Black people, beginning in 1865, they started calling it Jubilation Day, Freedom Day, the Black man's Independence Day, but never the 4th of July. When we look at the 4th of July, we go back to what Frederick Douglass said when he wrote in his speech, what does the 4th of July mean to the Negro? He tried to tell people that you're celebrating a false holiday for Black people, that the 4th of July did not free your ancestors. It was a separation of the United States from British England. So that's why a lot of people today still don't know the truth and why they celebrate July 4th. It's a day off for them. It's a day for them to have a cookout. They don't understand that July 4th is not a day of freedom. It did not free anybody. It freed us from England. The colored troops then, after they freed the people in Galveston, they started a campaign where they went from South Texas, where Galveston is, to Central Texas, all the way up to North Texas, freeing the 250,000 people that were still enslaved. After they did that, they started going into Oklahoma. They were told that people were still held in bondage in Oklahoma. So the last outpost of bonded servants that we know of was freed in Oklahoma in 1866. So we tell people that Juneteenth is symbolic. It's not the end of slavery. It's symbolic of the end of slavery only in Galveston, Texas, because there were a lot of states that still did not want to free their people. And we're talking about 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation signed on January 1st, 1863. So these people were illegally held as slaves, human bondage for 2.5 years before the United States colored troops finally got to them to tell them that they were no longer held in bondage. So that's a quick story about Juneteenth, how it got started, and why we celebrated.
Thank you.
May I mention one thing?
You can mention as much as you like.
I have participated on the 4th of July at Robin's house, where the speech of Frederick Douglass is read by people reading sections, while at the North Bridge is read the Declaration of Independence. So there is this across this road, the one thing happened and the other thing.
So that's a good question, because when I speak, I tell people that after the Emancipation Proclamation, people of color was held in bondage for another 89 years. So what freedom did they have that you could be held in bondage for another 89 years? And we just can't get people to understand the true meaning of July 4th and the true meaning of June 19th. In 2021, Juneteenth became a federal holiday, but there are still 22 states that refuse to recognize Juneteenth as a federal holiday. And this goes back to Martin Luther King Day, where we had to fight to get his holiday recognized. And now we're fighting to get Juneteenth recognized, because people say, we got July 4th in some states. They say, we got 4th of July, we don't need Juneteenth. And these are probably predominantly white states who want to keep their heritage of July 4th and not recognize that we are a union of diversity. And you just can't recognize one person's heritage and ignore the other person's heritage. And that's what some of these states in America are doing today. Where is the unity that they keep talking about? We hear it, and it's just like I tell people, when I start reading some of these constitutional documents, to me, they're only words on a piece of paper. If you're not going to live by them, they have no meaning. So,
you Stuart probably will confirm this. Is it true that Thomas Paine had a text of Declaration of Independence that was very strong against slavery, and they said the Southern colonists will never sign under this, so they took Jefferson's text? Is that I have read that?
Most likely.
He was not aristocrat, Thomas Paine, like Jefferson and Washington, and the other one, Hancock, signed the big signature.
So unfortunately, given our human nature, and that's what I want to bring us to conclude with the Concord Covenant, we are imperfect and appeared to be the reality. I'm not saying this is an excuse, merely an explanation that we wouldn't have been able to come together if certain interests hadn't unfortunately been compromised, which led inevitably to the Civil War. But I'd like to conclude by reading the Concord Church Covenant. This was found in the papers of Concord's founder, Peter Bulkley, and minister, the first minister. And it's an old-fashioned wording, but I think there are truths in here that can help us address the concerns that you've been good enough to raise, Calvin, and that others have noted. So I propose that we conclude with this reading of the Concord Covenant. And this is the second meeting, small and modest, to invite people of the different faiths in town, the different churches, the different religious groups, the Baha'i, the Quaker, the Jewish synagogue, the Christian churches, to come together in a Concord fellowship and to share of our faith with one another so we become fuller and more human. This reads as follows, again, taken from the papers of Concord's founding minister, Peter Bulkley, the great-great-uncle of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Considering the instability and inconstancy of our hearts, and cleaving to the Lord in that which is good, we do bind ourselves one with another this day before the Lord, that we will endeavor by the grace of God assisting us henceforth to walk as becometh the people of God, according to the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. And more particularly do we promise and covenant before the Lord that whereas he hath of his great goodness brought us from under the yoke and burdening of men's traditions to the precious liberty of his ordinances, speaking about everybody but blacks and other minorities, which we now do enjoy, we will, according to our places and callings, stand for the maintenance of this liberty to our utmost endeavor, and not return to any human ordinances from which we are escaped. And we further covenant to subject ourselves to every ordinance of Christ, which he shall please to make known to us to be his will. Also, we do take him to be our only priest to instruct us, our only high priest to make peace with the Father for us. So we will set him up as our king and sovereign to command us, to rule in us, and to reign over us by the help of his word and spirit. And that we may the better be kept in a holy subjection to him and his will, we will both watch over each other in the Lord, admonishing one another, both to prevent the evils into which we might fall and to recover ourselves out of those that we have been overtaken with, not suffering any raging pollution or spiritual uncleanliness amongst us, but labor to cast it forth by the power which Christ is given to his church. And the final paragraph. In further considering that we are members one of another and have civil respect and are liable to be oppressed and devoured of one another, and considering also the increase of this evil, daily getting strength through the abounding of self-love, so mightily prevailing in us, we do therefore here solemnly promise before the Lord that we will carefully avoid all oppression, griping, and hard dealing, and walk in peace, love, mercy, and equity towards each other, doing to others as we would they should do to us. And in the testimony of our willing assent to this covenant, we have hitherto subscribed our names. And I would just add that Thoreau said, I've met few Christians who have a genius for Christianity. And Emerson said, in an altered age, we worship the dead forms of our forefathers. The world holds on to a formal Christianity, and nobody dares to talk about the heart of Christianity for fear of shocking. So I'd offer that perspective, because this can come across very easily as being rather dogmatic and narrow, that there might be a Christianity and a Christianity, the latter led by the new commandment to love one another. So thank you all.
You said that he had enslaved Africans, Peter Bulkley? No. Because today, that's what I thought you told me.
2 other minutes.
Anyway, it's another interesting anniversary. On the 7th of June, 1893, Gandhi was thrown out of the train in Pietermaritzburg. So it's 130 years. We walked on that pilgrimage, we walked to that train station also, and there is statue of Gandhi in the center of Pietermaritzburg. Like such statues in many places, even in New York, with the staff walking. Right. Yeah. So that's 130 years from that. And all night he was there contemplating to go back to India or stay. Mm-hmm. And he decided to stay and confront all that races and spend over 20 years in South Africa before returning to India to continue the struggle for the independence from the British.
And his former grandson, who recently passed away and who's a friend and a colleague and a member of the Honorary Circle of Trustees of the Center for American Studies, Arun Gandhi said, "Thank God for those goddamn South African racists. If they hadn't kicked my grandfather off the train, he would have continued merrily on his way as a self-righteous, self-serving, self-important young lawyer. Instead, he became who he truly was. His first name wasn't Mahatma. It was Mohandas. Mahatma means great soul. And because of that adversity, he became who he truly was." So maybe there is a place in life now and again for these challenges.
Gandhi's name, Mohandas, means servant of God. He didn't care about being called Mahatma.
Lovely, lovely. So I'm going to give it back to our host, Andrew.
And we're going to wrap up this edition of Conversations with Andrew Williams Jr. with a true Concordian conversation. Thank you for joining us, and please join us again.